Welcome to Straight Talk. With me today is Paul Jebb. Paul, you are an independent legislative councillor. Now, I just want to start off by asking you this. Now that the opposition have either been disqualified or resigned from LegCo, it's mostly all pro-establishment people. How does it feel like to attend meetings when you don't have all the antiques that you used to have before?
Well, it's a mixed feeling, really. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, LegCo may have been a bit of sort of lagging its luster, if you like.
Because now when I watch live LegCo, there's no fun.
Well, I wouldn't describe what happened before as fun. All the antics, all the violence involved. I wouldn't say that it's fun. But certainly more actions and more sort of media focus and public attention on it. But I don't think those are healthy sort of situations. I would rather prefer what it was like before. Back in those days, when I first joined LegCo, in the old building, everyone is, even the Pan-Democrats, they are very sort of reasonable, very
restrained,
very restrained, very conciliatory.
But you had a new batch of opposition members who did things differently.
It started off with people like Wang Yukman and long hair and Chen Wei-yip, the three of them together. That's when the LegCo really turned into something else.
Yeah, I remember Jasper Zhang Yuxing telling me that Wang Yukman may have been problematic, but he was pretty smart.
He was. Talk about it, he's never been in prison for 1 day.
Yeah, even after throwing something at Siwa Leung, right? Yeah.
Right.
Now, because there are no opposition members in LegCo, people like yourselves, you have to question some government policies to show that at least it's not a rubber stamp LegCo, right?
Right.
But what I notice is after questioning government policies, all of you still passed the bill before you. There's not been one bill that has not been passed.
Well, if they are bills that should be passed, well, why shouldn't they be passed?
But there's not even been one that wasn't, or were there any abstentions or voting against? You got some 40-something members in there.
Certainly, we did have some abstentions. We did have some negative votes, but they're certainly in the minority, very minority.
Exactly.
And
does that serve Hong Kong
look at
well?
it. I mean, the major block of oppositions have gone, and that's probably why we have all Pan-Dems, the Democrats or the Republicans in the U.S. Congress. If the other party is gone, obviously you have all the votes in support of the government administration.
Even Republicans or Democrats sometimes vote against things or vote for
that's true.
Things.
They
right?
do, yeah.
Because I've covered Congress for many years, and I do know that even if something that the president supports, if you happen to be in the opposition party, you may still support it.
Right.
It just depends. But now, people say that LegCo is a hand-raising machine. I mean, how do you feel about being described like that?
Back in the pre-97 days, the British colonial days.
But how do you feel about that? Because you'll be among those who they say is a hand-raising machine.
It may not be the same LegCo that we've have before, the last few years, but certainly it is something that we have to do something to correct. I mean, we're still in the process of correcting the excessiveness before. So I wouldn't go to the conclusion so soon as to say we become an upper stamping council. Obviously, we still have different voices, we still have different concerns. But when it comes to voting, I cannot but agree with you that certainly the last few months we've seen quite a sort of unanimous, if not.
But that gives a wrong impression to the public, doesn't it?
That would. But I think, like I said, we'll be in a transitional period. Hopefully, we'll restore some kind of balance between now and when the new LegCo comes into session.
The new LegCo, there's going to be elections in December. I'll ask you about it in a bit.
Sure.
But I want to ask you this. The chief executive says normality has returned to LegCo and to Hong Kong. Now, I don't know what normality means in the way she describes it, right? But as you just said, most of the time now is unanimous vote.
But for one or two, yeah.
Yeah, okay. But then, I mean, is that a real normality in Hong Kong? Has normality really returned to Hong Kong? Or is there still that undercurrent of anger that has not been solved?
Well, it depends on which facet you look at it. If you're talking about law and order, certainly normality has restored somewhat. If you look at Let's Go without the violence or the antics and all the filibustering, of course, then perhaps normality has been restored somewhat. But if you talk about democracy as such, the way we've been developing from 97 onwards until now, some people would say certainly we are backtracking if you simply look at the element of democracy. But at the same time, if you look at the sort of society that we want to live in, I would say certainly we're far more normal than a few years back when we couldn't even go out to the streets and all that. So at the moment, it's still a very sort of a fragile situation. I agree with you that certainly some people's anger has been sort of...
well, the people went to the streets for a reason, right?
Yes.
It was anti-extradition bill to start with, and then it morphed into something different, right? I mean, there were a lot of grievances that haven't been solved. Even the central government says there are a lot of grievances in Hong Kong, like housing and wealth gap and so on. But now you have the chief executive coming out and saying everything's back to normal. Well, people say, well, it's not back to normal because you have just shut it down.
In a way, we're trying to correct something that we couldn't before. And during the process, maybe it's not that normal. But we're still, I mean, between the two pendulums, we're still, the two ends of the pendulum, we're still swinging back, if you like, in a way. So I wouldn't say we are right at the balance at the moment, right at the equilibrium stage at the moment, but hopefully we'll restore more equilibrium in due course.
Well, I'll give you an example, Paul, about how deep-seated this anger is, right? Some days ago, the customs people raided a warehouse and shops, chain stores, that was selling something from Thailand, and they said the labeling was wrong.
Right.
So then they sent 100 people to the warehouse, and after that, what happened was, for several days, Hong Kong people went up to all these stores and bought everything.
Right.
Bought everything back. That is an expression of anger.
Right.
You know, because they have no other way to express their anger anymore. There are no protests, there's nothing. So then this is the way they say, well, okay, that's what we do. We are using this to protest.
Right.
Doesn't that tell you something?
Well, like I said, I mean, we haven't actually gone to the state of equilibrium. We're certainly still trying to correct what was really wrong before. So if you look at the American society, immediately after 9/11, you perhaps see that people are not talking about civil liberties anymore. They're talking about security, talking about phone tapping to make sure the terrorists won't have their ways and things like that. So that was in the stage of panic, or that was the stage of trying to control what they have lost control with. So at the moment, I think Hong Kong, we're still experiencing this kind of situation where we are trying to restore a very chaotic situation. We're trying to recover some kind of law and order before we can talk about other things that we treasure very much in Hong Kong, like freedom, like all these other democratic values and things.
But surely the national security law and the election reforms, right, very sweeping election reforms,
right?
Surely those are not the solutions to what happened in 2019, right?
Right.
2019 goes deeper than that. Mm-hmm. Can those two things, the national security law and overhauling the entire election system, can that solve the grievances of 2019?
I cannot say that those are the all the antidotes that we need or the sufficient cure for Hong Kong society. Certainly, we need far more medicine, if you like, than that. But those are the very fundamental things that we need to have, like law and order first, before we talk about anything else. So at the moment, people, by and large, people are more tolerant of what's going on, even though normally they should be, very upset about all these electoral reforms and things. Certainly, a large part of the public is still expressing their dissatisfaction with what's going on.
How do you solve that?
I'm sorry?
How do you solve that, the dissatisfaction?
Well, like you said, strike. I mean, people, if they cannot come up with their votes, they can at least come up with the money to do something to register their stands. So we know that, and the government should know that too. Except that we still at the juncture of trying to restore law and order, trying to make sure that everything's under control first before we can talk about something else.
But then now they've more or less, under the new election system, they've more or less shut out the opposition. Is that also right for Hong Kong, or good for Hong Kong?
Depends on which kind of opposition we talk about. If they are the genuine opposition, if they are those opposition which is above board, in any society, you don't have opposition which is below the board, which is against the country's national interests, which blatantly, acts against the security of the country. You don't have that. But in Hong Kong, we did have some legislators which went far beyond what is acceptable to most other countries in the world in terms of when you become a parliamentarian or becomes a congressman, you don't go below certain standard.
But the people that were arrested, like 47, I think, people, legislators and politicians from the opposition, a lot of them were not against the country. A lot of them have come here, and I've asked them,
right,
are you patriotic? They said, of course I'm patriotic. Yeah. And I asked them, do you want to seek independence? They said, of course not. So yet they've been arrested.
Well, I mean, there are different sections, there are different background people. But certainly we did have people who went to the States to ask for sanctions against Hong Kong.
Yeah, some of them did, yes.
Yeah, and we did have people who openly say that, they don't want to be part of China, this sort of thing. So, I mean, there are obviously different scenarios you're talking about.
All right, quick break, see you soon. Welcome back. With me is Paul Chair. Paul, you're a legislative councillor and independent legislative councillor, but you're not really all that independent, are you? Because you're described as pro-establishment.
Well, you have to pro something, and whether you're for the government or the administration at the moment, or whether you're against it.
So how can you be independent when you're pro-government, pro-establishment?
Means we're not controlled by any party interests. We're not dependent on any particular group or sectors.
But if you forgive me for saying this, you are controlled by the liaison office, because the last time you ran,
I wouldn't use the word control,
they helped you.
But we are on good terms.
They helped you last time to win an election.
Well, certainly they're not against me, and certainly when it comes to resources, certainly a lot of things that can be mobilized by them will not work against my position.
I mentioned the liaison office. I want to ask you this. Is Carrie Lam really in charge anymore?
Well, why not?
Because a lot of people say she's no longer in charge. She's like a mayor.
It's a matter of degree, really. I mean, certainly I wouldn't disagree that we used to have, or the Hong Kong chief executive used to have far more respect, and the voice is far more sort of readily heard by the Beijing, by those up in Beijing. But everything has become far more systematic now, Hong Kong becoming like just a province, like this
right.
city in China, where we have a lot of more rigid systems to go by, if that's what you meant. But certainly when it comes to internal affairs, still, of course, CE is CE in Hong Kong.
Yeah, the CE is in charge of internal things like, building roads and housing and so on. But the major issues, like, for example, the national security law or the election reform, they didn't even know about it.
I wouldn't be able to answer that question for you, because I wouldn't even know what CE knew or did not know beforehand.
Well, they were asked, I think Teresa Chang was asked on radio about certain issues. She said doesn't even know. She had no clue at the time.
Which issue was it, actually?
I think it was the national security law or the election reform. It was just these two things. She hadn't been briefed on it yet, and so on.
Well, she's not been perhaps famous for being able to respond to questions very effectively.
You said it, I didn't. Now, another thing I asked whether Carrie Lam is in charge is with this election committee, which will be increased to 1,500 people.
Right.
Under the election reform, there will be a convener. It'll be either Siwa Leung or Tung Chee-hwa, right? And Tam Yu-chung, a member of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, says that convener will be above the chief executive.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that, really. I mean, looking at it, first off, it's not really clear what this convener is all about. Secondly, it's not clear how it would work, the convener. But as I take it, basically it's just a fallback position. Just make sure that in case anything goes wrong during the process, that somebody will be able to at least convene a meeting and to get some kind of consensus to relate the views back to Beijing. That's basically it. I wouldn't say that convener
Why
is
can't
someone
those views
with real
be
power.
relayed back to Beijing by the chief executive?
Well, if you like, you can compare that with the election of the NPC members. In the past, there's always been NPC elections going on in Hong Kong, but at the same time, nobody really knows how that works. And we always see the CE or somebody around that level, like some of the liaison officers, to be sitting up at the panel there, convening a meeting to conduct the election of the NPC deputies. I think that's all about it.
Are you saying that there should be more of a role for the liaison office, or we should follow what the NPC does?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. It's just that is how they try to preserve some kind of flexibility, perhaps. I'm just guessing because I don't know at the moment.
Sure.
We're still waiting to see what's going to happen. We're going to have the bill, on Wednesday this week. Then we'll find out more. But even so, I understand that the role of the convener would not be governed by local laws anyway.
Well, the next question I think you will know, and that is, LegCo elections will be in December. Are you going to run?
Don't even know about that. There's been talk about having the election in December, but chances are I'm not very confident that in fact we can have the timeline as smoothly as the government officials would like to put it.
Carrie Lam said that there are going to be 3 elections, and that's why you got to pass the bill very quickly, right? Right? There will be the election for the election committee that selects the chief executive, followed by LegCo elections, followed by the election for the chief executive, right? All these 3 things must be done right away, right?
That's the plan, really. I mean, just like she said, we're going to have election in September this year, but obviously that's been overtaken by events. And I'm not saying that we would have it, but what I'm saying is that I'm worrying whether we can actually have such a smooth process of electing of the EC members so that we can smoothly conduct our LegCo election in December. Chances are there might be delays, but assuming there aren't any delays, then obviously we're going to have the election this December.
And will you run? That was the question.
Well, it's still early to decide, really, because the number of, as you know, I'm a geographical constituency member.
Right, there are only 20 seats left for that.
Reduced from 35 to 20. There are far less seats to compete against each other. So we just have to see whether we can sort of work out a plan or something with other members who may be running at the same time with the like in my constituency, East Kowloon constituency, to decide whether we should stay in the geographical group or whether we should move on to something else.
What are your chances in LegCo with 90 seats, only 20 are directly elected? What are your chances of winning if you run?
If I decided to run, certainly I would have very I would be very confident that I would be able to win. But chances are I may not even run in the geographical constituency to start with.
There are other pathways for you to join LegCo,
There are other pathways,
right?
indeed, yes.
And you could consider those too, right?
I would certainly consider any pathway that would allow me to be able to serve the public further. If I do want to go on with this road.
Those are the words of Siwa Leung when he was asked whether he wants to be the chief executive or whether he wants to be the convener. Right. He says, I want to serve Hong Kong in any way that I can.
Politicians are politicians.
Now, there's been a lot of talk, Paul, about casting blank votes. I know you said that outlawing blank votes in itself is not right. You still stick to that point?
I wouldn't say not right, but certainly not appropriate or not necessary for the time being in Hong Kong. Various observations. First of all, we don't have compulsory voting, unlike Australia where they have to vote, otherwise they'll be committing a criminal offense. And so if you're advocating sort of casting blank vote, it might be against the spirit, if not the letter of the law. And secondly, I don't think we really need to go that far at this stage. Although I do recognize that out in the debate that people who mix up the two things, casting blank votes, and on the one hand, and advocating or organizing the casting of blank votes on the other. One is certainly within one's freedom.
What about if you're a block of people and you say, okay, let's all cast blank votes? That's still their right, right?
If you discuss among your social group, perhaps. If you say, oh, well, why don't we do it? There are no candidates that we should vote for on this election. Maybe that there are legitimate reasons for so doing, all right? But one's got to be careful, though, even when one's doing that, because there are existing laws for regulating people. When you advocate to vote for somebody or against another one, you may have some kind of restrictions that you have to observe, like all the election expenses and things. You have to be careful. But barring that, that's still within the law. You can do that. But if you go on a large-scale campaign, organizing, like we've seen before, some sort of campaign, and soliciting financial support from groups of people, including foreigners, foreign government, and so on and so forth, to do that, then you may have actually trouble with the national security legislations.
Why do you think that the government is afraid people will cast blank votes? Because there's also talk about compulsory voting. Do you support compulsory voting?
Without further studies, I wouldn't at this stage consider compulsory voting is something that we have to do in Hong Kong. But I wouldn't say the government is afraid of people casting blank votes. I think obviously any government in the world would like to see, or not any, but most governments in the world would probably prefer to see the elections being supported by the voters instead of having a very low voting percentage. So I think that's common sense. So if the government is sort of desirous having a more healthy election, at least perception-wise, then of course that's within the prerogative to do so. But at the same time, to actually make laws to make sure people cannot cast blank votes, it's another matter altogether. And at the moment, I don't see any reason, any rationale for that.
All right. Now, I've got just a minute or so left. Let me ask you to look into your crystal ball. How do you see the future of Hong Kong politically when you've got a new legislative council, opposition virtually shut out, 90 seats, only 20 are directly elected? You think, what do you see? I mean, under a system like that?
We don't need a sort of a crystal ball. We just have to go back to history. There will obviously be a far more orderly LegCo. It will probably be a more efficient LegCo, if you like.
Will there be a role for the opposition?
Well, it depends on what kind of opposition you're talking about. If they are above board, like what I talked about earlier, if they are not
good, loyal opposition, that's what you mean,
well,
right?
They don't even have to be loyal, but at least they don't actually. They have to just abide by their oath, and they don't go against the basic law and so on and so forth. If they are above board at this or that level, certainly any opposition is welcome. I think.
But the opposition will have very little say because you've got 20 directly elected seats. At most, they may win 10 out of 90. What's the point?
The point is, even if you have one member voicing something which is very reasonable.
You've got one now.
I think the government will listen. I mean, even these days in LegCo, I could see the government listening to rational voices still.
I've got to end the show. Thanks for watching.